Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today for the webinar with Scott Poland. We see a lot of people signing in, so we're going to take a minute just to let them continue to do this. We were overwhelmed with the number of registrants. In fact, if everybody who registered shows up, we won't be able to accommodate them. There were over 1,200 people signed up to join us today. And fortunately, we're on a webinar, so our space is pretty expansive. I also want to thank everybody from coming from various points far and wide. I'll just talk a little bit so you know that you're connected, and then we'll launch in a minute. But we have folks here from every state of the United States and Canada, Latin America, and France. So soyez les bienvenus, and let's go ahead and get started. We have such a packed agenda. So again, we're hosting the Suicide Prevention Legislation and Our Schools webinar with Scott Poland. I'm Jennifer Spiegler. I'm the Senior Vice President of Strategic Partnerships here at Kognito. Looking at our registration list, a lot of you know me, and I know a lot of you, and welcome to everyone. Either way, I'm going to do a little housekeeping. I want to make sure that you know that the presentation will be recorded, and we will make that recording available to you. We will follow up with a copy of the presentation slides, so you can be, rest assured you'll get that in your email. Attendees on this call, because there are so many of you, are in listen-only mode. That means you can't talk to us, but you can submit your questions. And so if you look at the right side of your screen, you'll notice there's a dialog box for asking questions, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. Scott has about 45 minutes of content, and so if some of you have to leave, that's fine. We'll leave the last 15 minutes for Q&A, and we will follow up with a briefing document that covers the questions that are asked. Just one word or two about Kognito. Kognito, we create digital simulations that prepare us for the conversations that matter most. These are simulations with virtual humans. Of course, in the K-12 context, there's no more important conversation than the one that can save a child's life. And we are very, very proud to have trained over 200,000 K-12 educators across the country with our mental health and suicide prevention simulations. These are listed on SAMHSA's National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices and the SPRC Best Practices Registry. And for many of you, these are available at no cost, thanks to sponsorships by states and local districts. So if you wonder if you're covered for free access to our trainings, please give us a call or send us an email, and we'll let you know that too. So a word about Scott, who, because we have such a high registration on this, probably needs no introduction. But Scott Poland is a professor at the College of Psychology and co-director of Suicide and Violence Prevention Office at Nova Southeastern University in Florida. Many of you know him as one of the authors of Suicide in Schools and other books. He is the co-author of a recent plan for the state of Texas, the Suicide Safer Schools Plan, and just the go-to guy on suicide prevention in schools. Scott, welcome, thank you, and let me hand this over to you now.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank all of you that are listening in today. And I want to begin with a conference that was held that the conference was very concerned about the increase of youth suicide. Pointed out that young people were under more pressure and competition really than ever before. Media seems to sensationalize the suicide of a young person. We've got a problem with clusters and contagion in youth suicide. Guns too available to suicidal youth. Schools the logical place to intervene. That conference was actually conducted by Sigmund Freud. The year was 1910. And someone who's worked in the schools for 26 years, progress has been slow. I'm excited that there's more state legislation. I'm excited that there's programs like Kognito, which is extremely well received in Texas, where I spent those 26 years. But we've got a lot of challenges. We have a lot of myths to overcome. And perhaps the biggest misperception still believed by many people making the key decisions in the schools, oh, we shouldn't talk about suicide. We shouldn't ask the kids about it. If we ask them about it, then that just might plant the idea in their head. And this is so far from the truth. It actually gives the child a chance to unburden it, and everybody who took the time to tune in today knows that not only does it give the student the opportunity to unburden themselves, but you are dealing with so many young people that are thinking about and even attempting use suicide. So as we move into our first slide about status of state legislation, you know, I still remember testifying in Texas in 1989 in front of the state legislature. My first book on the subject had just come out, and I was excited about that opportunity. And the state of Texas passed a resolution, but I learned what a resolution meant. Really absolutely nothing. It means this would be nice if you did it. Thankfully, a number of states have moved into state mandates. So if we could put up the slide that has to do with approximately 37 states have passed legislation that requires schools to do something. It's actually a combination of required versus recommended. And today I'm going to discuss what I believe would be comprehensive legislation in schools. And if we go on to the next slide in terms of the overview of legislation, there's a lot of variation in whether it's required or whether it is recommended. And obviously, as a psychologist with all those years in the schools, I believe it does need to be required. And I actually think suicide prevention cannot be a site-based issue. Suicide prevention really needs to come from the legislature, from the superintendent, from the school board, and we should be doing something in every school in America as we address either what is the second or third leading cause of death for young people. So there's variation also in the length of the training. And in some states like Pennsylvania, it's a little complicated to take 4 hours in 5 years. I think the simplest thing is to simply say a minimum of 1 hour of training for everybody who works in education. That would include administrators, counselors, teachers, classroom assistants, bus drivers, really everyone that interacts with students 1 hour every single year. Having said that, though, I would sometimes get a statement like this from an administrator. Oh, come on, Scott, you talked to the staff last year about this. Do we really need to do it again? Yes, we do. And I know that you have a number of new staff members, and it's important that we go over the basics of the warning signs and what to look for, what to do, and most importantly, do not keep a secret about suicide. And also, one other statement from an administrator was only willing to give us 8 minutes to talk to the middle school staff about suicide prevention. So I really like the 1 hour minimum, and we also need to make sure that there's documentation that those sessions are taking place. And there are some states that have done some other interesting things with regards to the overview, and I'd like to point those out and give those states credit. We back up one slide. Texas requires the designation of a suicide prevention expert for every single school district in the state. And I like the fact that in Texas, suicide prevention is also included in the campus improvement plan. Now, very few states have really addressed what I believe is a very important area, which has to do with training for key personnel, counselors, psychologists, social workers, and nurses. But that is in place in the state of Washington. Now, if we go to the next slide, I want to talk about where I hope this legislation will evolve. That would be looking at the state of West Virginia. See, Pennsylvania permits you to talk about suicide in the curriculum, but West Virginia is actually requiring information to be shared with students about suicide prevention. And I'm a very big fan of this. I admit, as you look at the wording there, it's a little bit vague. How do we carry that out? But here's the bottom line. Kids say things to each other that unfortunately the adults in their life are never going to hear. And I'm a very big fan of programs also like mental health screening, the SOS program that provides information to kids themselves about how to help yourself, how do you help your friend. And as we start talking about, the best practices programs in the National Registry, obviously I believe we must have the closest scrutiny of those programs that are actually provided to students. And by the way, it should never be a surprise to a kid that they walk into health class today and suddenly the subject is suicide. We should be building up to that and realizing that unfortunately youth suicide is linked with a lot of problems we do not want young people to have. As we move to our next slide that has to do with the state of Washington, and in Washington, they passed the Matt Adler Act. That was actually really focused on the needed training for private mental health and hospital personnel. But the state of Washington also passed legislation saying that for key mental health professionals in schools to renew your license, you must have at least 3 hours in suicide prevention. And for a number of years, I was the Prevention Division Director for the American Association of Suicidology. And they had a very important task force report that came out a couple of years ago about preventing suicide through increasing the competencies of the professionals managing and assessing suicide risk. They also called for training programs at the university level. They called for questions about suicide assessment and management for any kind of credentialing and licensing exam. If we're really going to save the lives of young people, we have to have school counselors, social workers, school psychologists very well trained in knowing how to intervene, assess the situation, provide appropriate services. And I want to take a moment and talk about the Jason Flatt Act. And I'm actually honored that I, in fact, know Mr. Clark Flatt personally, and what the Jason Foundation has accomplished in my mind is just incredible. Of course, I was very excited when this first legislation passed in Texas in 2007, but I thought to myself at that time, well, I mean, was Jason's uncle, is he like the governor? But I now know Mr. Flatt and know his dedication. And I also know that most suicide prevention in this country is driven by survivors that will not give up. And the Jason Flatt Act, which does require training for teachers, has now passed in 16 different states. And I'm proud to tell you that with my partner, Rich Lieberman, we did some modules for the Jason Foundation, one on suicide and self-injury, and yes, there is a relationship. One on suicide and bullying, yes, there is a strong association. So my hat's off to the Jason Foundation. In many ways, they have been leading and providing needed momentum in so many states. Now, I'm also very proud to talk with you about the Suicide Safer School Plan for the state of Texas, which is our very next slide. And basically, my wife was a longtime principal in Texas. I have a lot of contacts there and had the opportunity to develop the plan for the state. And all I can do is speak honestly today. And Texas passed legislation in 2013 about suicide prevention in the schools. I was really excited. Traveling and presenting all around the state, unfortunately, most school personnel never got the message about the required training. So essentially, legislation passed again in 2015, and that legislation is being promoted in many ways by the State Department of Health Services as well as Mental Health America, Texas. But still, there's a gap between the legislation is in place and really have schools accepted the responsibility. So what we did with this plan, and I'm really proud to tell you that my wife, the former principal, is the co-author of the plan with me. And I remember telling her, oh, Donna, we're going to knock this out in about 30 or 40 pages. Well, it turned out to be about 95 pages addressing prevention, intervention, and postvention. And my wife and I are currently in counseling as a result of this project we worked on together. No, I'm only kidding about that part. But I hope that you will go to texassuicideprevention.org. You will look at the plan. And in my mind, it's really a blueprint for all states. The legislation is a little bit different in states, but what we really need to do for prevention, intervention, and postvention is exactly the same in every single state. And I also wish there was some kind of forum or statement out there that would really guide the various legislatures that are looking at suicide prevention legislation for schools. As Delaware is currently looking at it, I found out earlier today Nebraska did pass legislation this last year. Really, these states don't need to be recreating the wheel. We need to give them good, comprehensive information about what should be in the plan for the state. The other thing that's absolutely critical is that legislation for schools should build on the capacity and the existing programs that are already in the state. If there's a suicide prevention council, there are suicide prevention coalitions, if there's the suicide prevention office, and whatever we're doing for the adult population, well, we need to build on that as we provide information for the schools as well. So moving on, I think it's really important that I also say that the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has a model policy. They also recommend 2 hours of training. You heard me say earlier, I think it's much more realistic. We might actually get it done with 1 hour, but there also needs to be some kind of a documentation or procedure. And schools are often required to turn in things to the State Board of Education. They might have to turn things into an education agency, or in Texas, for example, there's the Texas School Safety Center. And if we already have to turn in information for the Texas School Safety Center about our crisis intervention and our safety plans, well, that would be a very logical place to make sure that suicide prevention is also taken care of as per the mandates in our state. And I just cannot emphasize enough, I see a big disconnection between, yes, it's on the books, this is what schools need to do, but we have to have some kind of a mechanism to make sure that they actually do it, that they don't ignore this legislation and initiatives that can save lives of our young people. So let's go ahead and look at my recommendations. And I've mentioned a couple of those. You heard me say 1 hour is what I recommend for all school personnel. But then I think I need to talk in particular about suicide prevention information for students. I very much am for this. West Virginia is the only state that I know that is actually mandating it. But I want to make a couple of statements here, and these are based on, well, really I've been working on this problem for 35 years. Presentations to students are very important. They do need to be done in a classroom or smaller format. So that means no assemblies. And in a classroom, I would love to see this information presented by a mental health professional with another adult in the room. And why is the other adult in the room important? Well, the other adult can help us gauge the reactions of students. We need to create a climate where students will raise their hand and ask a question. And going out to a small district, Trinity, Texas, after a suicide, talking to students in small groups, one student raised his hand and basically said, "Why weren't you here last week? If you'd have been here last week, I would have known my friend Keith was suicidal. I would have known what to look for and what to do." And really, we need to be in every secondary classroom in America clarifying this doesn't have to happen. It's not destiny, it's not fate, it's not inherited, and here's how to get help for yourself or for your friends. And then I like it when the state legislative bodies build in some funding. I'm not one that's going to say suicide prevention in the schools is going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. But as we move and make it comprehensive in terms of the best possible programs for students, in terms of the best possible training to intervene for our counselors, nurses, school psychologists, social workers, that will take a little bit of money to create the kind of training programs that they need. So moving on to my recommendations continued. I've already talked about the 1 hour minimum. Schools need to become much more familiar with the National Registry of Best Practices. Having had an opportunity to talk to, frankly, hundreds of thousands of school personnel around the country, every single state, they're not familiar with the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. They're not familiar with the Best Practice Registry. Often they're not even familiar with the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey. And then I've already made the point about if it was up to me, state legislation would provide not just the training for all staff on the awareness and the warning signs. It would provide the best practices programs possible to teach secondary students the warning signs and how to get help for a suicidal friend or themselves. And then I would require training for all those key mental health professionals. In fact, I think sometimes I found in Texas they were written into the education code. Counselors were as key personnel in suicide prevention, but that may not have been a part of their university preparation. That might not have even something they were familiar with their designated role, and there had really been no opportunity on the job to learn the key principles of intervention. Now I'm going to move into case law, and I believe this area is really important. In fact, in my experience, perhaps the only thing that will really require schools to get active in suicide prevention is awareness of the liability cases. And I'm sorry to say that it often comes to this, but of course here's the bottom line. It's very difficult to sue a school district and win. Schools almost always, the personnel have sovereign immunity, and unless they really just ignored the most dramatic warning signs. In fact, one attorney said one of the things to look at is, did the personnel of the school, did their behavior, does it shock your conscience that they were so cavalier in not responding to the suicidal young person? So let's look at a case from Hillsborough, Florida, and I now reside in Florida, and I'm only going to talk to you about cases that I'm extremely familiar with. Several of these cases I actually did in fact provide testimony. So the Hope Whistle case was basically one of the first sexting cases in the country. Unfortunately, middle school girl sent a picture of herself topless to a boy. He did, unfortunately, what most boys in America do, sent that picture to everyone. Well, Hope is harassed, taunted, and she is disciplined at school. And if we go on to the next slide, basically, let's look at the case. What was it really about? So a couple of months after the harassment, Hope has a fresh cut on her arm. Teacher notices it, calls for the social worker. Social worker did in fact meet with Hope on a Friday, had Hope sign a no-harm contract. Everybody listening needs to know that the terminology and the approach has changed. Today we need to jointly develop a safety plan between the adult and the suicidal student. But a no-harm contract was actually signed by Hope and the social worker. Hope went home that weekend. Her parents were not contacted. After the funeral, Mom is cleaning out the backpack, and there, in fact, is the no-harm contract signed by the social worker and her daughter. Well, they sued. And if you're listening carefully, you're thinking, well, what in the world could be their defense in not notifying the parents when they believed a child to be suicidal? But the district basically argued, as other districts have, This didn't happen at school. What's this have to do with us? They also argued that they were not responsible for the social worker who did not follow their policies and procedures for parent notification. And the plaintiff's attorney failed to even ask, where's your documentation you ever trained your social worker? The lawsuit was, the district did prevail, and it's not that I wanted them to pay out millions of dollars, but I want parents of suicidal students to be notified. In fact, there's only one exception in my opinion. You believe the child is being abused, well, now you're not calling their parents, you are calling the Department of Protective Services. So let's move on to the very next case, which is bringing up some issues about bullying and suicide. Please know that we could spend an entire webinar on this subject. Numerous lawsuits have been brought against school districts. The parents believe the school's failure to stop the bullying was a direct and proximal cause of the death of their child. Well, first of all, what's the literature say? Strong association between bullying and suicide. That means if we know a kid is being victimized, they're being bullied, we shouldn't hesitate to ask them about hopelessness, thoughts of giving up, and suicide. But to date, no case has actually been brought successfully against a school. You do see the Blue Springs, Missouri case. I was on the side of the school district. I recommended they not settle out of court. I did not believe they made grievous errors, but they did settle out of court. I was on the side of Lance versus Louisville ISD. I was on the side of the plaintiff. That case went all the way to the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court. The Louisville School District prevailed. To be honest, it's very difficult to sue a school district. In my opinion, the Louisville School District made many errors, and it's not that I want them to pay out millions of dollars either. But had they lost that case, and I believe they should have, then every superintendent in the state of Texas would have stood up, taken notice, and made sure we're doing a better job of responding to students that are suicidal and the victims of bullying. The Kentucky Supreme Court is currently hearing a case from Floyd County, and we'll have to all follow the outcome of that case. So let's move on through the next couple of slides rather quickly in terms of, I've already mentioned, legal terms and issues. Schools are almost always granted immunity. Attorneys argue using the term intervening force. It wouldn't matter what anybody might do. Suicide was still the decision of the individual, unpredictable. We can't really do anything about it. They've even argued against policies and procedures for suicide prevention in schools, basically saying that if you put those policies and procedures in place, then you could be held accountable. And I find that in stark conflict to that we have passed legislation now in so many states. And then there's the question of, does a special relationship exist? Your kid has to go to school unless you provide homebound instruction for them. And do we have this special relationship? And I've argued in some of these cases, the younger the child, the more disabilities they have, the more I believe the special relationship does exist. And the negligence would basically be always looking at, is there something that they should have done, some kind of duty that was owed, and should they have been able to foresee the young person was at risk for suicide? As we move to the Waikiki versus Polk County case, and that's also from right here in Florida, I was on the side of the plaintiff. So please keep the foreseeability question in mind for the assistant principal. Custodian's deposition said, Sean Waikiki tried to hang himself at lunch. I physically stopped him. I went out and told the assistant principal, this boy just tried to hang himself. After school, Sean Waikiki tried again. His best friend, a boy named John, got off the school bus, ran into the house. Best friend's mother now knows Sean Waikiki just tried to hang himself after school. I wish she'd called Mrs. Waikiki, but she did not. But she did call the assistant principal, telling him, "My son says Sean just tried to hang himself a few minutes ago after school." So now 2 adults have notified the assistant principal of suicidal behavior. He tells best friend's mom, "Don't you worry about it. I'll take care of it tomorrow." And I think everybody listening would realize this cannot wait till tomorrow, but it does. The next morning, Sean Whitey came in. They headline in Education Week, if you looked it up, "Assistant Principal reads suicidal young person scriptures from the Bible." I don't care about that part. What I care about is everything he did not do. Did not increase supervision, did not call for counseling help, most importantly, did not notify Mrs. Whitey. That's one of the very few cases in the entire country where a school district was held responsible in a court of law with monetary damages. Let's look at the next one. The next one is for my old school district, Cypress Fairbanks, third biggest district in Texas, about 100,000 students. By the way, I know Assistant Principal Fowler. I like him. He's a very good guy. So what's the case all about? 8th grade girl was suspected of selling drugs on campus. She was disciplined. She was told in the presence of her mother, her name was Brandy, "Brandy, you're not welcome at Blau Middle School right now. We are recommending placement at the alternative school. You are, in fact, suspended." I'm really sorry to tell you that Brandy's mother dropped her off at home, went back to work. A few minutes later, Brandy was dead using the family handgun, left a note behind that said something like, "I'm sorry, goodbye forever. Yes, I sold the drugs." Well, they sued us, and our defense was no warning signs, no talking, writing about suicide, no giving away prized possessions, no dramatic changes in behavior. We prevailed in court, but the plaintiff's attorney argued something that I will forever remember. Given the scope and the number of suicidal secondary students, every kid in America being severely disciplined should be questioned about depression, hopelessness, and thoughts of suicide. Frankly, that's going to be a very tough sell to administrators in this country. However, what do I really think? The plaintiff's attorney is absolutely correct. And I've talked to Mr. Fowler many times over the years, and here's the kind of things he said to me. I wished I'd spent a little more time with her. I should have said, "Brandy, we do care about you. You just can't be at Blau Middle School right now. Mom, this has got to be a very stressful day for your daughter. Can you stay home with her? And Brandy, maybe you should talk to the counselor for a few minutes before you leave today. This has to be a very stressful day for you." And the bottom line is a severe discipline situation can very much be a precipitating event for a youth suicide. Oh, I would predict Brandy had already thought about suicide. And being disciplined, suspended, and facing expulsion basically caused her to act on her earlier thought out suicidal plan. So let's look at the next case from the state of Washington. Earlier, I talked about the importance of training for key personnel like counselors. Let's take a moment and look at what did the counselor know about the student? Well, he wrote a suicide note. He's rumored to be in a pact. His best friend at his new school is in the hospital now because the best friend attempted suicide yesterday, but the student denied suicidal ideation. And everything does say be direct. I cannot overemphasize that point. But let's look at the other things on the next slide that the counselor also knew. As I said, he'd only been there about 5 weeks. He's facing going back to court in Seattle where he is charged with a felony. We know that he's rumored to be in a pact. He lives with grandma. He doesn't get along with mom. Mom's attempted suicide several times, and let's call him Tom. And has even told Tom, "I bet you'll kill yourself someday." Tom reports that he used to have a drinking problem, but now he's sober. Well, here's my question for you. How many protective factors did you see there? I only saw one good thing. That is he had a good relationship with grandma. I saw a lot of risk factors. and it also happened to be report card day. He took it home that afternoon. Grandma was not notified about his suicide note, rumor of being in a pact. He has a very bad report card. They have an argument. He runs off. He died by suicide, and the school district settled out of court. And I share this case today just to try to highlight the need for suicide assessment and management training for key school personnel. The next case from Shawnee Mission, Kansas, is, as far as I know, the only case of its kind ever about postvention. So to quickly summarize it for you, what's it about? Two boys in the same family that attended the same Shawnee Mission High School died by suicide about 6 months apart. The school district did absolutely nothing in the fall after the suicide of the youngest brother, who was a sophomore. There was no outreach to the family. There was no helping the friends with their shock, grief, confusion, and maybe even guilt. In fact, they were quoted. What's this have to do with us? We teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. And please know that the literature about suicide postvention in schools never said do nothing. In fact, it talked about the importance of providing support to all those affected, as well as emphasizing how to help yourself, how to help your friends if they ever become suicidal. So the older brother's having a little problem, understandably, goes to mom and says, "Mom, I want to go back to Michigan where we used to live. Ever since my younger brother killed himself, I'm not the same. I need a break." So he comes back to the high school in Shawnee Mission in May. Mom's deposition said the counselor reportedly called him in, said, "Sorry, can't accept these credits from the state of Michigan. You will not be graduating." "No, gee, this is really sad news. Let's see what else we could do. So sorry to tell you this, knowing that you lost your younger brother to suicide a few months ago." Well, mom has one child left, an 8th grader. The next fall, he's about to start school at that same high school. Mom asked for a transfer that was turned down, which is one of the stupidest administrative decisions possible. Now she's angry. She decides to sue them, although having talked with her and being involved in the case, I know what she wanted, which is what the parents who lost children to suicide want. They want prevention. They want schools to do better. They want schools to accept responsibility. The outcome of the case very quickly is they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars fighting her in court. They ultimately settled with her in mediation, and I hope everybody listening is familiar with After a Suicide, a toolkit for schools put out by the Suicide Prevention Resource Center and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So, best practices for schools. Keep up with the literature. Know the kind of resources that I just mentioned to you. Implement the state plan. Have a suicide prevention expert for every district. Know and utilize the local and state resources. In Texas, they have 30 coalitions for suicide prevention around the state, which provide tremendous support to communities and schools in prevention. I also think it's very important that we document that we actually did the training and that we provide that specialized training to those key mental health professionals. And I'd like to see state legislation require suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention to be in district and campus improvement or safety plans. And we need to recognize that strong association between bullying and suicide. And this next thing, for everybody listening, I have a question for you. If I were to visit your school or district website right now, and in the search engine I typed in youth suicide or teen depression, what would come up? And I'm willing to bet absolutely nothing comes up. And what I would like to see is information about awareness, warning signs, how can a kid help himself, what could a parent do, who could they contact in school, they're worried about their child being depressed and suicidal. I'd like to see the National Crisis Hotline number, as well as local and state emergency resources. We move on to the very next slide. I've already talked about parent notification. It needs to be prompt. There needs to be a handoff from the school personnel to the suicidal student to the parent. We need to be making referral to community agencies. We need to monitor and follow up. And I believe strongly we need to persuasively ask for a release of information so that if they do receive private services, we can coordinate our efforts at school with the community provider and practitioner. In addition, of course, we need a reentry program when a suicidal young person returns to school. And only one exception to notifying the parents when you believe their child to be suicidal. If you believe they're being abused, now you're calling protective services. We use all of our skills, and our challenge is to get a supportive reaction from the parents. We need to be familiar with the emergency procedures in our particular state. We need to be familiar with the education code. What if a parent says, "You're so off base about this, don't ever talk to my kid again"? Well, in Texas, anytime we believe a minor to be suicidal, key personnel can and must talk with them about their suicidal thoughts. I also suggest an emergency documentation form so that we have a record that, yes, in fact, the school was notified of the suicidal behavior of their child. So if we move on to the next one, I think the only thing there that I've not already talked about is we need to be working as a team, suicide prevention safety team in our schools. We move to the very next slide, final thoughts. The bottom line, schools have been very reluctant historically to accept a responsibility for suicide prevention. Yet this is where a kid is 8 hours a day, half of the days of the entire year. And perhaps only the lawsuits will actually get the attention of reluctant administrators. And I would obviously argue we need to improve our training at the university level for our teachers, our administrators, and our mental health professionals so that they're knowledgeable about the scope of this problem and what to do. The next couple of slides do give you the website for AFSP, the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. And my final thought before I turn it back over to Jennifer is this simple. Suicide prevention is the responsibility of schools. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. What? I'm muted? Thank you so much, Scott. That was fantastic, and we have a slew of questions that have been posed that are coming in. Many of our audience would love to have you come and train them specifically at their schools. I don't know how many of those you can do in a year. But let me start. One question came up about frequency. So you mentioned a couple times that you think an hour is sufficient and doable. How often would you recommend that? Would you recommend that to be annual, or the questioner said, are these skills perishable, which I believe we all think they are. So how often should people be trained?
I would definitely recommend every year so that we don't forget some of the key components of the training. There may be something new. We're now more aware, for example, that middle school students are using as a method. So there's always going to be some new information, and reminders are really important. And somebody who might have been a key person on our suicide prevention safety team might have retired. And in the training, we need to make sure we know who their replacement is.
Exactly. Okay, well that leads into another really good question, which is, we talked a lot about training. What do you think, what training do you need to have to be the school's suicide prevention expert? You talked about the need for a suicide prevention expert at least at the district level. So how does that person get training?
Well, it's interesting that I don't know that there's any absolute consensus on that. Obviously, Kognito trainings are very important. The Jason Foundation has a series of modules. The American Association of Suicidology also has a credential, but I don't know that there's one specific thing as much as in our communities and certainly in our state. There are conferences. For example, I know you're going to the American Association of Suicidology National Convention. That would be a wonderful place for somebody to get training. A national convention is not possible. Training at the state level. Texas, for example, has region service centers. They have 20 of them. And what I would love to have them do is decide that we would believe would constitute becoming the suicide prevention expert for your school.
Great. One of our questioners asks about federal legislation. Is it possible that there could be federal legislation around suicide prevention in schools?
Well, all we have, of course, is the Garrett Lee Smith Memorial Act, really in memory of a congressman's son who died by suicide. He was a college student, and those GLS grants, as we refer to them, they are available for states. They're particularly available for universities, which I did receive one here at Nova Southeastern University. But I would obviously like to see more federal legislation, guidance, and more funding for youth suicide prevention K-12 schools.
What about, so most of the legislation covers middle and high school. More and more folks are seeing deaths by suicide in elementary school. Do you think that that would be recommended to add to state legislation?
Yes, I certainly do, and I share their concern. And one of the cases that I mentioned, the Blue Springs, Missouri case, that young man was only 10 years old. He handed a suicide note with a picture of himself hanging to his 5th grade classmate, and it said something like, "If somebody doesn't stop me, I'll kill myself at 4:35 today." The problem is we never anticipated a 10-year-old classmate ever being in that position, and we need to talk about suicide prevention more in our homes, our schools, and our churches. I don't know that anybody has the exact answer of what's the ideal program at the elementary level. I've almost found it a little bit contradictory that I've found elementary principals more interested in my work than high school principals. And I mean, the biggest problem, obviously, is at the high school and middle school level. And at the elementary level, I think somehow we have to get across to kids, if something doesn't seem right, you've got this feeling in the pit of your stomach that something bad can happen, you've got to go to an adult immediately. At the same time, we need to all be researching and trying to come up with the most appropriate, developmental language to talk to younger children about suicide. And I am a big believer in telling the truth. And often in our families, it's years later before somebody finds out what actually happened to their favorite uncle. But I do believe in telling the truth, but our language has got to be really just right on for younger kids.
Thanks. Absolutely. And some folks on the call will be familiar with our new elementary school gatekeeper program, which is pending review for the SPRC Best Practices Registry. We really struggled with exactly what you're talking about, how to talk, how to demonstrate educators talking to younger students. Another question that's come up, are you familiar with new California-specific legislation, Scott, that's being considered in California?
No, I'm not.
Okay, we aren't either, so that's for all of us to find out. I do want to tell everybody we've gotten several questions. Yes, the slides that we've been presenting, that Scott's presented, will be emailed to you with all of the resources that he's been talking about. So Rest assured that you'll get those. We also have a question coming in from Texas, whether the Kognito program satisfies your training mandate. Yes, it does, and it's free across the state. We've had a great response to it, so please use it. Another question, what about middle schools? Is the training that is required different, or the approach different from middle school and high school?
I think it's really very similar to middle school level, and of course we have variations in who's in a middle school. I mean, whether it's a 7-8, whether it's a 6-7-8, but unfortunately, 6th grade students are being faced with suicidal comments and actions of their classmates, and I believe we just need to start at a really early age and really demystifying some of the misperceptions. This doesn't have to happen. You know, one of the things I like to demonstrate in classes and with young people is iPhones. You ask Siri, you say something to Siri like, I want to kill myself. Today, Siri connects you with the National Crisis Hotline. So if they've got an iPhone, they've got help available with the push of one button.
Right. Good point. And, you know, we so much worry about the effect of these devices on our kids. Sometimes they're really helpful. One questioner asks about youth mental health first aid and your opinion of that.
Well, I know that it's being used a lot in Texas. I'm a very big fan of mental health first aid, absolutely. And the more training we can have for personnel in terms of, one of the things that I think is absolutely critical for students' well-being is building relationships between every student and adults at school. Having a significant adult that knows your hopes and dreams, certainly your name, somebody that you can connect with, whether you go to them because somebody's made a suicidal statement or whether you go to them because somebody's talked about hurting other people. And I'll be honest, I'm very concerned about the lack of connections when we have these massive high schools in many places in our country. So I like to say, I hope every single kid sincerely believes somebody at school cares whether they showed up today or not.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. And all of those connections are so important. Kids have a safe place to go in school. One question from a teacher. She says, I know there's legislation in my state, but I can't get the administration's support. What can I do?
Well, that's a great question. I think one of the things that's really important is for the teacher to gather accurate information about the scope of the problem. They can look at the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey, for example. They could contact Kognito to find out, you know, the exact incidence of the problem. Print out a copy of the legislation and sit down and hopefully be able to convince the administrator, look, this is a really big problem. We don't have to wait till it happens to implement suicide prevention. This isn't a suggestion from our state legislature. This is a requirement. And I would hope that that person would come around. And of course, as I said earlier, I think part of the problem is that the word is not coming down from the superintendent's office and from the school board. So if it was, then it would be implemented as required in that particular state. And sometimes there's certainly consequences to this, but sometimes we have to elevate our concern. And if the administrator does not respond, maybe we have to make somebody at the central office aware that I work in the school, I know the legislation, we're not doing it, please help me get it done.
Thanks. Yeah, that's great. I have a really hard question for you here. She says, what would the protocol be if a student expresses or there's some knowledge of a family whose religious or cultural beliefs would result in the student not getting help if the parent were contacted?
Well, that is a very challenging one, and I think that, you know, we have to use our best personnel to try to convince a parent to get that assistance. And then I demonstrated this in my class last weekend because I did a role play with a very antagonistic parent. And the final trump card that we don't want to play too early is to simply say, in our state, it's negligence not to get help for a suicidal minor. And you're going to give me no choice but to call the Protective Services Department, and then they will be checking in with you. And that's kind of like our final trump card. But obviously, we hope that we can use all of our training and skills, and the parents and the school personnel can be on the same page about what needs to be done. But I think that call needs to be made to Protective Services, and then we'll let them sort it out.
Great. Another tough one. Should teachers be informed about prescription drugs that students are taking, and do some of these prescription drugs cause depression? How can this issue be addressed?
All right. Well, that gives me a chance to ask or to talk about. Sometimes in our schools, like let's say the counselor knows the kid's suicidal and they're like, I don't think I should tell any teachers. Well, frankly, I believe that we need to treat teachers very professionally. And if a teacher knows that a child's been depressed and suicidal, then they're going to be watching much more carefully, and maybe they won't miss some obvious warning signs and statements they made or things that they write. Now, let's talk about the antidepressant medications and the black diamond warning. Many of us, and me included, believe that a contributing factor to the rise in the youth suicide rate has been the black diamond warning and the parents' really unwillingness to seek out needed medications. In fact, when a suicide of a young person occurs, I usually think of it this way. It was untreated or undertreated mental illness, most likely depression. And we really need physicians that monitor medications carefully. We need parents and teenagers themselves to understand what the medications do or don't do. And if the student or the parents don't like a medication, we need to encourage them to go back and talk to their physician. I have seen antidepressants help a lot of young people. And then to quote Paul Quinnett of QPR, Question, Persuade, Refer, he said, the black diamond warning, it should be on the mental health specialist. And what was he really saying with that? Something I said earlier. Unfortunately, most mental health professionals in our schools and outside of our schools really not are well trained in suicide assessment and management. So if I'm making a referral of a suicidal student, I work in the schools, I want to make sure I make a referral to a mental health professional in the community that I know is well versed in suicide assessment and management.
Great, thank you so much. What about seasonality and student suicides or suicide attempts? The question here is, do you believe it is in the best interest of students for administrators to send out a letter in June advising parents to keep a watch for any signs of suicide over the course of the summer? We know that first use of alcohol onset is highest in the summer. What about suicide and this kind of warning to parents?
Well, the literature is going to say adolescent suicides increase in the springtime. I think according to Thomas Joyner, he specifically said May and June. You know, a letter going out to parents is a good idea, but I would talk about a lot of things about being involved in your child's life this summer, looking for any kind of warning signs of substance abuse or depression, making sure that, you know, things that they're doing that involve motor vehicles are safe. So really that's the kind of information I would like to see school personnel provide to parents consistently throughout the school career and especially in the high school years. I got a chance to talk to the parents of 4-year-olds at a preschool the other day. About 100% of preschool parents are going to show up. So here's what I made them promise me. 10 years from now, your kid's going to be in high school. Whatever programs the schools have, I want you to go to every single one of them because it's going to be more important when they're 14 than when they're 4. And all those programs that schools have about, the graduation plan and all these requirements, those are really important. But if I was planning them, I'd get a few minutes in every meeting about, oh, you've got young drivers. Here's some things you need to know about graduated driving laws. Here's some things to know about how to tell if your kid is really just a moody, irritable teen, or are they really depressed. I'd like to see that kind of information provided all the time, with the key message of be involved in your kid's life. And all that technology, it's a privilege. It's not a right. And parents need to take control of that. And unfortunately, many of them give away the farm, and the kid's still in elementary school with regards to technology.
That's a subject for a whole other webinar. As a mother of a 14-year-old.
Absolutely.
There are so many questions rolling in. Again, we're going to send out the slides, a link to the recording, and all of Scott's resources will be in there. We don't have time for further questions today. We do want to point out that Scott is going to come back and be with us March 24th for a conversation about what's happening at the higher education level. So Scott and everybody on the line, you want parents to show up in high school. Well, we're happy to say that hundreds and hundreds of people have shown up today to hear this from wherever they are. And so thank you so much. And we will see you in March, or on the 24th.
My pleasure, Jennifer.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody.